imagine if a medium average of us are able to have our emotional expressions being met in terms of, if we're happy, we laugh, if we're sad, we cry, if we're frustrated, we let people know, if we're angry, we hit. Like, it's a very wide range of, imagine like the 80 plus piano keys on a piano. We can play the full range of emotions as we're kids. And then as we grow up, we have education, we have parents, we have relationships, we have friendships, we have heartaches, we have school, business, work, etc., etc. For those listening, my hands are getting smaller and smaller on the piano. You get used to playing on this very small range. I think one of the ideas, the concept of like, being yourself, being your true authentic self, being your effortless self, all this kind of stuff. I think it's about looking at this and going, how much am I allowing myself to re-express some of that range? How much am I really giving myself permission to dream, to express? That's one aspect. The other aspect that I found personally is that it actually takes a lot of effort and energy to hide and to pretend and to be someone else. Now, remember that we are extremely adaptive creatures because we've had to be. I mean, if you look at, the thousands of years of evolution, one thing that was clear is that we had to fit in, because if you didn't, if you had like an opinion that was contrary to like the common beliefs of your peers and groups and tribe, you were kicked out. And if you were kicked out, the chance of survival were very slim. And forget about mating and reproducing yourself, that's just not going to happen. I want to name that, because if there's one thing I learned in this whole process, that 7 years of hosting my podcast, a lot of the issue isn't so much information or logic or reason. A lot of it's emotion and psychological. We can break down a bunch of tools and tactics on how to be more yourself, or how to be more authentic, or how to, manage difficult conversations and all this stuff. But if you don't address the elephant in the room, which is, I'm just really scared of what might happen if people really know who I am.
Doctor's Kitchen. Recipes, health, lifestyle. Mark, first of all, I just want to say thank you, because I think I was on your podcast many years ago, the Unconventionalists, and I'm pretty sure that was like if not one of the first pods I'd ever done. And like the way you just, honestly, the way you just showed up, you whacked out these microphones, the camera set up
in your living room,
here. It was literally in this living room right here. The couch is actually where I was standing here, but I've changed it because I put the kitchen bar in here and stuff. But yeah, that was literally the first pod, and that was like the first time I think pods came on my radar. I started listening to them. Yours was probably one of the first that I started listening to, and since doing my own podcast, it's sort of like opened up my world to the breadth of incredible people there are out there. And I guess, that's what we're going to be talking about today, about how everyone has a story, and there's so much we can do to connect better with other people. So yeah, I thought I'd just start with a thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. And trust me, it's an honor to be here on your podcast. And yeah, I remember it was great conversation. I appreciated your candid honesty. And I know we had some chats offline, and look, I've appreciated the friendship that we've grown over the years, and just thank you for having me.
No, of course, man. So let's get started. Why don't we introduce you to the audience who perhaps haven't come across your work? You're slightly different to the regular guests that we have here in the Doctor's Kitchen, but I think it's important nonetheless. And I think you've got an awesome story to tell as well. So take it away.
So my name's Mark Leruste. It's unpronounceable because my dad's French and nobody's perfect, so don't blame me for that. But it's I was born and raised in France. I think probably a part of the story that's relevant is, I grew up in the 80s in France, and I'm a dyslexic kid. And if I'd been diagnosed back then, or if I'd been born 10 years later, I would have probably been severely medicated on ADD or some stuff like that. I was a hyperactive kid. So I struggled at school, and I was bullied, which is actually not an interesting, but it's an unusual situation where I was bullied not by my peers, but by my teachers, because I couldn't spell. I really struggled to spell and read out loud and do maths. And that didn't fit very well in like the archaic French educational system. And so I just had this voice in the back of me, which is delusional at best, but actually super helpful, which was, you're going to get through this. And one day, you'll live to see better days. And I was held back a year. Then eventually I was kicked out of conventional school. And I was just so determined. I still managed to go to university and had a bit of a weird random career. But the reason why I bring that up is I think from a young age, I understood what it felt to feel misunderstood and to feel like I didn't have a voice or I didn't fit in, even though I felt like this didn't feel normal, if that makes sense. And fast forward to today, it's a lot of the work that I do is I kind of wear two hats. On one side, I work with entrepreneurs and business leaders to try and impact the world with their message. and their story. And on the other side, I go and work with companies who are trying to change dramatically their culture for the better, who are trying to infuse a sense of meaning, of purpose within their organization, but more than that, a sense of belonging, where people feel like they can bring their true authentic self, whatever that means, with the challenge that come with that. And I think I bridge the worlds of being an employee and being a leader, because I've been on both sides. And I try and bring a bit of compassion and a bit of humor to this often difficult topic of, 86% of employees worldwide feel disengaged at work. And I guess one of the missions that I'm on as well is to eradicate career misery in the workplace.
86%.
Yeah, that's a Gallup study that came out and basically found that across the world, I think it was like 135 countries studied. 86% of employees feel emotionally disengaged from the work they do. In the time of recording, there's this great resignation that we're hearing about, right, since post-COVID, and it's something that I just feel isn't right, And I've been in situations. So I spent my career, I spent about 10 years in the corporate world and the nonprofit world. So for your listeners who might be aware, it's Movember season at the time of recording this podcast. And I was country manager there for 4 years, and I helped raise 2.8 million euros for men's health and got 110,000 people sign up and all that stuff. But what was amazing to see was all I had was, a little backpack, a questionable mustache, and a story. And that's all I had. And I was basically asked, like, go to Europe and try and launch the foundation in a few European countries. And there used to be this joke. My nickname was Rusty at Movember. Not a lot of people know this, but my nickname was Rusty. And they used to call it the Rusty effect. And it was when I used to go into market, like I used to go and travel across Belgium, Spain, France, and Switzerland. And numbers of registrations would go up. And the only reason that happened is because I would just try and talk to anyone and everyone I could. And I would share the story of Movember. And then I would link my personal story to why raising awareness about mental health and men's health was important to me. And that was, I think, the seed that was planted around this idea of we've all got a story. And when we can connect the stories of our past to why we do what we do, it's a really powerful combination.
Yeah, dude, that's incredible, and the numbers are still like flabbergasting. I mean, we've spoken on the podcast actually with a couple of people about this topic. One was Stephen McGregor, who is you probably come across his work. He's written a fantastic book very recently called The Daily Reset, and he talks about workplace well-being, workplace wellness, and I think that emotional engagement with what you do on a daily basis is super critical to your overall well-being, because if you feel that disconnected to something that we spend 70 to 80% of our lives doing, it's no wonder that people lack purpose and people lack the sort of the happy. I mean, I always sort of regard myself and a lot of my friends who are other entrepreneurs like yourself as lucky, not because we get to have some of the perks of running your own business, doing it on your own time, even though we probably work more than your traditional hours, but we're lucky and privileged because we have an understanding or an inkling of, we know what we want, and we can go out and achieve that and work towards that goal. And I think a lot of people will be in corporate jobs, but other jobs as well, not really having that sort of connection with purpose. And I think it's a critical piece to, that the ikigai, it's the that traditional sort of idea of purpose, connection, and
it's hard, 100%, and it's hard. And for those who love a good TEDx talk, go and check it out. I gave a TEDx talk in 2017 that's done quite well, but the foundation of it was this idea that people think that they're going to quit their job and start their business and they're going to be happy. But the figures are horrific when you actually look. I think Dr. Freeman, one of the Californian researchers that looked into one of the first to look at the correlation between mental health and entrepreneurs, basically found like this staggering facts that you're like 3 times more likely to have depression and all these kind of mental health issues as a result of being an entrepreneur. So why are so many people still driven to this idea, even though like 90% chance of failing, right?
Yeah.
And kind of what I found was, it's not so much starting the business that we're looking for. It's what we think starting a business will bring us that we're looking for. And it's that feeling and that sense of belonging, of working towards something that feels important and meaningful. And what I learned through the research from my book in Glow in the Dark is that we all have a need to feel part of an important narrative, that we feel like we are part of something meaningful and special. What I find fascinating is that I would say the vast majority of us don't see how our stories are interesting. I mean, you've come on the show and you shared your story on my podcast, and I've had hundreds of other guests, and I'm amazed and shocked at how many people I'd come off and I'd be like, wow, that's like a really inspiring, powerful story. And they'd be like, really? I don't really see it that way. And I don't know if that's something that you felt, but literally, again, I got a message from, someone was listening saying, listen to, X episode of Vanessa Bella, for example, and said that story was really meaningful and powerful. So I relay that message back to Vanessa, right? And she says, I really still struggle to see. It's crazy. I'm humbled and grateful, but I struggle to see how meaningful or important or valuable the story can be. So yeah, my heart goes out to a lot of people. I just want to say one thing. I was asked the other day, I think it was a cab driver asked me, what keeps you motivated? And I said, it's not motivation, it's drive, which is, it's a bit of a difference. I don't know if you can relate to this. It's like motivation for me fluctuates on a day-to-day basis. I can wake up feeling a bit groggy, feeling excited, but I find that finding something that drives you can be way more powerful, because then it's about showing up even when you don't feel like it. And when it comes down to working, I think, especially in companies and corporates, find something that drives you, and it doesn't have to be big. I think one of the big issues I see around purpose is this idea that we need to be a world-changing, business-changing kind of mission. No, I think, there's countless examples out there, which I think people, Nancy Duarte is one of them. She decided for a year and a half to paint 100 paintings, small paintings, so all the people she was grateful for in her life. And then she did an exhibition where she showed all those paintings. It's quite emotional. You can watch like a video of it. But the point was, it's not this world-changing thing, but it made her feel a sense of fulfillment. It gave her a sense of drive, and it enabled her to give back to those she cared about and to show people that, she was appreciative. So a bit of food for thought.
Yeah, no, that's epic. I'm definitely gonna look that up. Is that like a video on YouTube or something where you can watch how she?
Yeah, I can send you the link. It's if you type in Nancy Duarte, I think it's I'll send you the link.
That's amazing.
But because I'm
dyslexic,
awesome. By the way, just anybody just listening to this, I'm dyslexic, so I sometimes confuse names. So Nancy Duarte might be someone completely different. I might be thinking about someone who studies public speaking, and she might have a very similar name. So anyone listening to this, don't trust what I say. Just look at the show notes, because I'll be able to back
look at the show notes. I'll correct it in the show notes. No worries. But that's a really interesting point you make there about entrepreneurs having high rates of depression, and what may have motivated them to leave in the first place was a drive or a searching for happiness in other areas. And you mentioned this. This is something that I hear about a lot. Being true to your authentic self. And I think particularly, in our character limited social media platforms, it can be bandied around a lot. But I don't know if people understand the process or have the tools or are knowledgeable of the tools to try and figure what that actually means for them. And I wonder, along the arc of your career and your journey, how you've determined that, and whether that's in flux for you as well, whether the shifts on a yearly, or hopefully not more regularly than yearly, but on a sort of on a time period basis for you. How was that journey for you?
I love that question. Yeah, the metaphor that came up is like an onion, like layers. I think if you think of it as a metaphor for people listening to this, think about it as a piano. I think when we're born, most of us have some form of privilege of having our emotional range still pretty much intact. Of course, there are different situations where we are unfortunate and on households that don't permit those kind of emotional expressions. I don't want to take that for granted, but imagine if, overall, a medium average of us are able to have our emotional expressions being met in terms of, if we're happy, we laugh. If we're sad, we cry. If we're frustrated, we let people know. If we're angry, we hit. Like, it's a very wide range of, imagine like the 80, plus piano keys on a piano. We can play the full range of emotions as we're kids. And then as we grow up, we have education, we have parents, we have relationships, we have friendships, we have heartaches, we have school, business, work, etc., etc. And for those listening, my hands are getting smaller and smaller on the piano. And then you get used to playing on this very small range of keys. if that makes sense. So I think one of the ideas, the concept of like, being yourself, being your true authentic self, being your effortless self, all this kind of stuff. I think it's about looking at this and going, how much am I allowing myself to re-express some of that range? How much am I really giving myself permission to dream, to express, to feel, to whatever? That's one aspect. The other aspect that I found personally is that, and this is going to sound really strange, and again, I talk about this in the book around your story, but it actually takes a lot of effort and energy to hide and to pretend and to be someone else. Now, remember that we are extremely adaptive creatures because we've had to be. I mean, if you look at, the thousands of years of evolution, one thing that was clear is that we had to fit in, right? Because if you didn't, if you had like an opinion that was contrary to like the common beliefs of your peers and groups and tribe, you were kicked out. And if you were kicked out, the chance of survival were very slim. And forget about mating and reproducing yourself. That's just not going to happen. So it's actually ingrained in us to make sure that we fit in. It is absolutely part of our DNA to make sure that we don't stand out, rock the boat, or potentially fear being rejected. So I want to name that, because if there's one thing I learned in this whole process, that 7 years of hosting my podcast, of writing this book and researching this book, is that a lot of the issue isn't so much information or logic or reason. A lot of it's emotion and psychological. And what I mean by that is, we can break down a bunch of tools and tactics on how to be more yourself, or how to be more authentic, or how to, manage difficult conversations and all this stuff. But if you don't address the elephant in the room, which is, I'm just really scared of what might happen if people really know who I am. Like, the book title of my book originally was going to be "If Only You, if you knew who I was," or if only you knew who I was, but it was taken. And that's because I think fundamentally we are scared. And look, I don't want to get too deep too soon in this podcast, but what I've found is that most of the time it comes down to the fundamental question of, am I enough? And do I love myself unconditionally? That's it. And I've worked with CEOs, with MDs, with founders, entrepreneurs, some of the multinationals. It doesn't matter. It always comes back down to those questions. And what I found is that if you can answer those questions of, yeah, I am enough with exactly what I have right now, and I am lovable for who I am, I am darkness and I'm light, and both are needed. If you can marry those two, then I feel it's much easier to accept who you are, and therefore be more comfortable with the potential of being rejected by others, because you've accepted yourself first, if that makes sense. Whereas if you haven't accepted yourself first, you're much more vulnerable to fear the rejection of others, because it's a confirmation of what you're already struggling with. I don't know if that makes sense, if I'm still tracking here, but it is something that I find that is at the core of all this. Because what I'm saying, like, I remember giving a talk at this big event, and someone said, employees I'm hiring now, they're expecting to show up with blue hair and piercings, and we're like a really corporate and very serious environment, and blah, blah, blah. And they want to be themselves, but it doesn't fit. And I think this brings an interesting question, which is, at what point do we consider bringing ourselves being a hindrance to the business? And what are some of the archaic belief systems that we've still bought in, such as, do you have blue hair? Does that mean you can't do your job? I would argue no, right? But it's also about meeting people where they are. And I could go on a tangent on this for a while, but I just wanted to pause and to make sure that that made sense. This idea of accepting, and it's no easy feat. There's a reason why there's therapy and coaching and, all that stuff. I mean, I'm still on that journey, right? I literally, right in front of me, for people who can only see this, I've got a board behind my camera, and I am darkness and I am light, and both are needed. And that's a real journey for me, to accept the shadow, to accept the darkness inside of me, the fact that I can be selfish, the fact that I can be jealous, the fact that I can be judgmental, all these things that I hate, like I really put judgment on. The more that I've learned to accept those things, the more I've just showed up as myself. And the biggest compliment I get on a regular basis when I talk on stage, or when people come up to me, is, you're the same. And hopefully you felt the same, but I'm the same whether I'm on this podcast, whether I'm on a stage, whether I'm writing in my book, or you see me in the street, or I'm playing with my kids. I'm the same guy. And I think that ultimately is, for me, one of the biggest tokens of freedom, to feel like I can navigate effortlessly between the different roles of my life. And of course, if I go and speak to my kids' school, I'm not going to swear. Like, I'm not going to be, I'm not going to share certain stories. And again, that, not to plug the book over and over, but I found that one of the big issues people had around understanding what stories are relevant, it was actually understanding what was the relevant context in which those stories could be shared. So, for example, I'm sure you've got like a stack of stories, right? Especially in your line of work that you've seen over the years, and how you open up your TED talk is really powerful. And so some of those stories are going to be relevant in certain contexts, but in certain contexts they won't. And so my my goal is to help teach people to say, you can absolutely share your story, no matter how scary that is, no matter how how much shame you have around your story, no matter how much fear of your story. But I would say not necessarily everywhere, if that makes sense. There are certain
Yeah.
environments where you are more prone to get a safer response than you would. And I learned that the hard way. And I can tell you the story if you want at some point. But the idea is, we have open wounds and they're not yet scars. And while they're open wounds, you might be better off to talk to a really intimate friend, someone you really trust, or talk to a professional, a therapist, someone that will hold the space without any judgment. Because I've heard it from friends, from clients, who've been through sexual abuse, who've been some form of trauma, and they've opened up maybe to a family member and it really backfired. And as a result, they kind of shut back like a turtle. And I've had to unpack that, working with them around, look, it wasn't that the story was too much to handle. It was the person you shared it with just wasn't the right person to receive it. And so to navigate those conversations, I think is really important.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, there's so much there that I want to unpack. I mean, on a very personal level, I think the podcast, as my podcast, has been an incredible tool of self-expression. That's helped me on my journey. And I think there's two fundamental questions. I mean, I love like the TLDR of most things, right? Like the too long didn't read. Like, I just want to get down to the point. I think it's my analytical mind. It's the fact that I love bullet points. It's the fact that I love a plan. I like to tick things off. Like, I think it's probably one of the aftermath things of being a junior doctor, where you have like a suite of jobs and you have a little tick box and you check them off. Like, I just love that. And so having the knowledge of what at least one needs to work towards, obviously personalizing it to them, but really around the two core questions: am I enough and do I love myself? I think these are like, just hacks to happiness. And obviously there's going to be a lot of process, and it's going to be very, very different depending on that person's experiences and their childhood, etc., and their current environment. But I think that those are like really, really critical questions to ask everyone listening to this or watching this, to ask themselves.
Yeah, and the trick is to not judge yourself if the answer is no. I think that's like my message at this point is, it's okay. We go through these moments of, sometimes I shout at my kids and I feel like a horrible dad. And if I had to answer, do I love myself right now? No, I'd struggle in that moment. But, Dr. Valerie Young, who wrote the book, the Secret Thoughts of Successful Women, it's an odd title for a great book about imposter syndrome. She calls them imposter moments, as opposed to you're feeling like an imposter. Like, I'm having an imposter moment. And so I think it's like you're maybe having a wobble moment, but it doesn't mean on the average of like the day of the month of the week that you don't accept yourself. But 100%, those two questions. And I would add a third one, which is, am I lovable? Because that's the result of those two questions. Am I enough? Do I love myself? If the answer is yes, then yeah, I'm lovable. And I would argue that it's difficult to be in relationship with others truly if we don't do a little bit of work around those questions. And I know that's challenging and tough, but yeah, I believe it.
Yeah. And you mentioned you had to learn some of this the hard way. I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing perhaps your own experiences.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah. So, okay, so there's the gazillion examples, but one of them that comes to mind is years ago. I was working with someone like a coach, right? He wasn't a therapist or a registered psychologist. He was just, kind of a life coach, kind of. But there's some great life coaches out there, by the way. And I used to do life coaching for many years and stuff. So I'm, a big fan. And I felt it was a safe space, and I kind of opened up about something that I had a lot of shame about. It was back then. It was something around relationship. That was it. That I was just struggling in my relationship. I was struggling with ideations of having affairs and all this kind of stuff. And instead of being met with a a curiosity and acceptance, which I've since years later learned through like therapy. It was a really judgmental reaction of kind of like, this is not a way to be as a man. Who do you think you are? Your partner needs to know these thoughts, and I shut down. And I remember having vulnerability hangover the next day, going, I should have never said that. Why did I say that? I was stupid. I was silly, and blaming me. And over the years, I managed to unpack that experience by just realizing, oh, it triggered something in this person that couldn't be with what I was sharing, but it wasn't necessarily my fault in that sense. And one story I think that really captures that and some, and I kind of share this story towards the end of the book, but so my mum has a complicated history and background in terms of her family dynamics. And her whole life when she was a kid, she'd basically been told it was her fault, right? So she carried this shame and this guilt through pretty much her whole life until early adulthood. And she hadn't told anyone. I think she might have told one person, like her best friend / her cousin. I think it was the only person who knew about the truth, right? And I'm putting air quotes here. She moves in with my dad in France. So she's Welsh, she's born and raised in Britain, but comes over to France in her early 20s to be with my dad. And kind of, for some reason, thinks if I'm going to be living the rest of my life with this man, I should probably tell him about this story. So she tells my dad the truth for the first time, this story, and she's got tremendous guilt and shame, and she thinks that he's going to leave her because of this. And because I'm incredibly fortunate and just landed a really lucky star, I've got a very kind and gentle dad. He's the opposite of like the alpha male, if you want.
Yeah.
He basically looked at her and said, your mom had no right to tell you those things. It's not your fault. And she just broke into tears. And as she was telling me the story, and it's in the book, and she allowed me to share the story in the book, she was moved, and she's in her 70s now, right? And I was moved, and it took her 24 years to realize that the story that she had believed deeply, that it was her fault, that she should be ashamed and guilty for everything that happened in terms of her family dynamic, it wasn't her fault. And it just took someone to look at her and said that wasn't right. That shouldn't have happened. And I think that's an example of a perfect example of a story well received, if that makes sense. Someone she trusted, she felt comfortable with, and he took the story and he held her in the way that she needed. So I'm forever grateful, for that moment. But I don't know if that answers their questions. I kind of go off on tangents, but that's
no. I mean, I love the tangents, and we love tangents on the podcast. And I think, I wonder how many people, even at a subconscious level, are holding onto judgments about themselves without realizing that can manifest in a variety of different ways. I mean, there's a clear relationship between those ill thoughts and physical disease, as well as mental health issues. So, it's I think these are really important topics to discuss, and I think having strategies to at least try and discover them, and also I think to your point about being vulnerable, but in the context of ensuring that the person you're being vulnerable with is either trained or is accepting or is generally the right person to be vulnerable in front of, because it can backfire.
Trust, ultimately. That you absolutely you trust. And look at, and my message to people is that you might not always get it right, and that's okay, and it's scary, right? I mean, I would argue that you'd be hard to find someone listening to this or even out in the planet that doesn't have some story that they wrestle with, a story that they wish nobody knew, a story that they wish they could go back and change, a story that they feel has impacted them in some way. Like, we all hold these stories. And what I've learned over and over and over again through my work and through the podcast is that more often than none, these stories that we're so deeply ashamed of and afraid of are the most powerful tools of connection that we have. Dax Shepard's a great example of this, armchair expert, host, and American producer and actor. I love his podcast. He's been in AA for many years, and he talks a lot about the power benefits of, the 12 steps. But he talks about, you go into these AA meetings and people say some stuff that you should really like want to hate them, and judge them, but because they own them as like a flaw and they're desperately trying to heal and recover from, you can't help but find empathy and try and find compassion towards it, right? And so my message to anybody listening to this is, first, have a little bit of compassion and empathy towards yourself, because we mess up. We do things we're not proud of. We do things we wish we could do differently. Like, we all have that in common. I think a universal human experience is that we all have things we've gone through that we wish or regret having gone through. And I find that often when you like struggle to connect with someone, whether that's a leader, whether that's a team member, a friend, a colleague, or what have you, is that you don't feel that there's a level of vulnerability or authenticity that you can connect to. I have this example I talk about in the book. Ash, I started working with this client, and he was, by all means, pretty successful. Like, he was, he competed in Team GB as a kid. He got like a gold disc as like a choir boy. He's been, in as like an army leader and in tours in Afghan and so forth, and been decorated by the Queen. Blah blah blah. And I was just listening to this, as like, this is all superhuman stuff. It doesn't feel relatable. But actually, when I dug deeper into his background, I found out that his dad had substance abuse and had an alcohol problem and was violent around the house. And so he often had to step in front of his mum and his sister to protect them. And I was like, oh my gosh, have you ever shared that? So he's like, no way. And I was like, but that's what explains why you do what you do today. That's why you're a leader of women and men. And, that's why you want to go into companies and help them treat each other better. Because as a kid, you had to step up. And it took him a year for that to marinate. He eventually got on a podcast and shared the story and wrote back to me and said, you'll be proud and happy to hear that I finally did. And it's, and then the rest is history. But we all carry those.
Yeah. Well, let's switch gears a bit and talk about Glow in the Dark a bit more about the book, and finding those stories that you are willing to share, and really spell out your purpose and meaning. I mean, I'm fascinated with this idea of how, this is the reason why TED Talks are so popular, right? Because we naturally align emotionally and connect with people better through the medium of stories. And I was doing a bit of research around René Girard, who I've only just come across over the last 6-12 months, something like that, who is the French philosopher who came up with the mimetic theory, and found this through looking through Shakespeare and these incredible novelists, and found this common theory of like, the main characters, the protagonists in most stories, are looking up to someone from the past, and they are essentially in their shadow, and they're trying to overcome their shadow or build on what they are modeling. And so his theory is like, well, we're basically all just sort of copying each other. We're sort of like, miming the actions and sort of the achievements of other people. And I just think that the way in which we do that is by telling stories and inspiring each other. So I wonder if you could give us sort of like the crux of the book, and how people sort of can find their confidence, because I guess this is a lot to do with having the ability and nurturing the energy to be confident enough to tell your story.
Yeah, and it's scary. Like, I'm just going to name that straight away. I'm not pretending like what I'm asking of you is easy. I think it's definitely worth it. I used to say that the Trojan horse of my book was healing, to a friend of mine, Emily Gindelsberger, who's the author of, Please Make Me Love Me. And she said, stop making that your Trojan horse. That should be like your central premise and promise of the book. And that's my ultimate promise to you. And really, and I stand by it, which is, you will not recognize who you've become once you unpack, own, and start sharing your story. Because what happens, it changes the way you see yourself. It changes the way how you feel. It changes the way how you interact with your partner, your plants, your pets, your kids, your family, your peers, your colleagues. It's a ripple effect, because the way that you show up when you start accepting who you are means that you're no longer hiding or dodging or playing defense. if that makes sense. Again, an example of this is a client. I talk about him as well, and her in the book. But this is someone who had an early stage career of being a professional poker player, and for whatever reason, just felt really embarrassed by that. And he's the CEO and MD of a successful company, multiple seven-figure business, and deals in a very serious industry of finance and money, all this stuff. And he just felt like nobody can know about this. And what was interesting is, as we would work together and I helped him unpack his story and all this stuff, he started to share his story with anyone and everyone he could. So from someone behind the till at the supermarket to his physio, to his new employees, like he was just so passionate about explaining to them why he started this company. And he came back to me when he was like, Mark, oh my God, this is amazing. Like, I can't believe I haven't been doing this sooner. I was sitting at this table and I started talking about poker, and they're like, oh my God, we play poker too. And I've been invited to like this really awesome table. And it turns out like, the minister of this or that, and it's just, and this is why I wrote this book. The reason why I'm sharing these kind of stories is I kept on seeing this on a one-to-one. And I thought, more people need to hear this and to have both a practical tool. Because as you said, I think your brain will, like, the book is basically split into two parts, just to break it down. The first part is I'm trying to convince you on an emotional and intellectual level that stories matter, right? So like, if you look at it from almost from like a corridor level, right? So like the very big thing is like, why do we even care about stories? We talk about in the book about we're actually hardwired to respond and listen to stories. It's, when our larynx started to lengthen and we started cooking food around fires, we started sharing stories, and the stories, most of them were about how to survive, how to mate, how to find shelter, how to avoid poison, how to hunt. And so we had to pay attention. If we didn't, we just didn't survive. So they actually did a Princeton study of an MRI where they took one person who started sharing a story and another person listening, and they duplicated this experience. What they found is that at the start of the experiment, if you look at the MRI scans, the brain activity was completely dissociate and not matching. But as soon as the stories started sharing about their personal stories, you could see the brain activity in the waves matching. And so what they started realizing is the amygdala, right, the nuclei, almond shape, triggers emotional responses from our behavior, our emotions, and that is dictated heavily by storytelling. We pay attention. I share this great social experiment, which is one of my favorite experiments, where these two social anthropologists took eBay, right? They went to a thrift shop and boot sale shop, whoever's listening to what it is, basically like secondhand junk, right? They bought on average for like 80p or like $1.20 these items, okay? And they matched each item with a professional copywriter or storyteller, if you want, who wrote a story. So unfortunately, those of you who are listening won't be able to see this, but Rupi, bear with me, okay? So I am showing you right now a little kind of teddy, right? It looks like this old school mouse with a cape and a little mask on it.
It looks
okay?
like Danger Mouse.
So if I just told you like, yeah, Danger Mouse, there you go.
Yeah.
So, if you look at Danger Mouse like that, you'd be like, oh, that's probably worth, how much do you think this is worth as it is?
£2-3.
£2-3. Cool. But what if I told you that actually this particular Danger Mouse is the Danger Mouse that my great-grandfather, who was fighting in the Second World War and actually was a massive part of the resistance in France, got caught. And the only possession he had time to get with him when he went to concentration camp was this Danger Mouse. And he carried it with him in his back pocket and managed to hide it all the way. He gave it to my grandmother, and he said, give this to your grandson one day and tell him that there is nothing that he can't overcome. How much do you think this is worth now?
Oh, it's priceless.
Yeah.
Absolutely
right?
priceless.
So, and by the way, it's a true story about my great-grandfather. It's not true about this mouse. But the point is, the emotional connection that you just had with the same object just completely changed. And so that's what they did. They did this at scale. And like the results, I talk about the stats and stuff in the book, but the results were staggering. I think they sold for like £8,900 worth of items, and they would then explain to people who bought the items that, they were fictional stories and they gave money to charity. But what they wanted to point was stories completely removes rationale. We become emotionally invested. It's why we queue for, Apple products for days in advance. It's why we're ready to spend, a small mortgage on sneakers because they've been limited series. Like all this is part of storytelling. So when we think about, we often do business with people we know, like, and trust. right? There was a Google study, they called it the 0 moment of truth in 2012, which they want to understand, why do we click purchase? Why do we click buy on products? It's because there's a certain number of hours and interaction touch points that we need so that we say yes. And what they found is that we buy from people we know, like, and trust. And I don't think anything achieves that faster or better than someone who's willing to own and accept their flaws and who shares it in service of others. Because there's a big, I just want to say this right now, and maybe you might agree with me or not, and please feel free to disagree with me. I think it's a healthy part of the conversation. But I think there is also this thing about being vulnerable and honest, and like you can just spill your guts online. And I think that can be great, but sometimes it could be like, why? Like, what's the point of this? Is it because you're looking for validation? Because actually, to answer the question of am I enough and am I lovable, the answer is no. So please remind me. And sometimes we need that. Don't get me wrong. But what I try and advocate in the book is, yes, it's your story, but it's not for you. You know, and I think that's what helps a lot of people listening to this. If they're stuck in this idea of like, I don't want to be the center of attention, I don't want to make the story about me. Well, here's the good news. It's actually not, it's not for you. Yeah, it's about you, but it's not for you. It's for someone who somewhere woke up this morning needing to hear your story to not feel alone, because your story can change the trajectory of their life. It really can. And the best tip I have around that is this obsession and this fear that we have of, I don't want to be in the spotlight. You know, even you, Ruby, me at the start, I wonder maybe when you started off, like, I'm really passionate about this idea of like the doctor's kitchen and educating and empowering people to make better choices through their health, through their plates. But I don't want to put my face out there. Like, I don't want to be like, look at me, 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 me. Well, what I found is the secret is to see yourself not as having to be in the spotlight, but becoming the spotlight. And so by shining a light on a message, on a cause, on a problem, on an issue that you really feel passionate about. Like, I remember when we talked, one of the things I was really fascinated about years ago was this idea that you wanted to be able to train medical professionals across the country to feel more empowered. And I've seen what you've done now with like hospital lunches, and it's just like stratospherical stuff, right? But you became the vehicle for a message. And I truly believe that if you started off on Instagram and saying, look how great I am, look how amazing I am, look how great my porridge looks like, yeah, you would have got a few likes and followers, but you would have never got the impact and success that you've had today. I think because you continuously are the vehicle for this message that you believe in, people root for you, people want to follow you, people want to champion your mission. And that's what I want people to understand, is that your story becomes a bigger message, right? Like, your story is the beginning. But once you identify what the message of your story is, and I give a 3-step framework in the book, you can become almost unstoppable, because you no longer fear the repercussion of what people might say, because it doesn't matter. There's this great quote, again, because I'm dyslexic, I've mixed things up, but that basically says you could be the juiciest, ripest peach in the world, people still will have a problem with peaches, right? And I think if you figure that thing out, which is, what do I want to become the vehicle for? What do I want to become the spotlight for? Everything falls. And I'll finish with this one example on that point. Greta Thunberg, right? Most people know who Greta is by now. And you might have an opinion. You might, regardless of that, bear with me for a second. When she was 13, 14, right, and she started striking outside of school on Fridays for climate change, she really believed that it was her responsibility to do this, because she felt like no one was doing it, and she had to raise awareness about our house is burning. Then suddenly the local media picks it up. Then The Guardian picks up. International press starts picking it up. She starts getting invited to go and give a TEDx talk. She goes to the UN. She then gets a book deal with Penguin. She gets a documentary. She has a partnership with Leonardo DiCaprio. Blah, blah, blah. Millions of followers on Instagram. That happened because she shone a light on something that was important, not because she made it all about her. You can argue about whatever you want. I truly believe that I don't think she was seeking attention when she started this. Not for herself. She was seeking attention for the cause. And I think that's what your story can really unleash.
Yeah. Dude, there's so much I want to unpack there again. And I love tangents. These are brilliant. I actually have quite a lot of respect for people like Greta, and I agree. I don't think she did it for herself. I think she's really, shining a spotlight on what needs to be shone on. And it's funny talking about my own story. So I actually took years to get in front of a camera. There's some videos from like I started the Doctor's Kitchen like 2015. There's some videos from like 2012 that will never see the light of day. It was just like me practicing in the kitchen. I had a buddy of mine, the only person that I confided in, that, I wanted to start this thing because I was running late in clinic the whole time, like explaining recipes to people, and I just needed to share it and get it out there and stuff. So it took me like a good 4 or 5 years before I even mustered the confidence to get in front of the camera. And I think, yeah, you're right. Like having that confidence to talk about my story, my frustrations with the medical system, sort of putting my head above the parapet, so to speak. It was scary, and it's still scary, to be honest. Even today, like,
Sure.
after doing this and building the brand and all the rest of it, it's still uncomfortable to get out there and talk about these things so openly. But because I have the sort of the cause and the mission behind it, is kind of what propels me forward. And the other thing to your point about particularly the use of vulnerability, even the words vulnerability online, I feel sometimes in a micro and macro environment, they can be almost weaponized for the purposes of, selfish gain. So, on a micro level, you have certain influencers, I don't know. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm sure there are some genuine people out there, but like crying online and, having the camera in front of them and like say, I'm feeling vulnerable. Like, yes, I get it. Sometimes it is really important because that can certainly make certain people feel better. But the sort of skeptical side of me is like, okay, this doesn't necessarily mean that this is helpful for everyone. And actually you can spot when people are gaining. It's almost like on a macro level, greenwashing. It's kind of like, when H&M says, oh, we're doing this amazing stuff over here and look how great we are. But at the end of the day, you're making masses of profits on the other side, whilst pushing out this story that makes you look better on this side. Whereas that's a fraction of actually, your intention and everything. So, I just want to put that out there because I think it's important to recognize that people are abusing this in certain domains. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, and look, it's going to happen. It's a pendulum, right? We always go through some sort of shift and change. What I will say is, don't let that. If you're listening, because I 100% agree with you, by the way, and if you are also recognize that, don't let that get in the way of you feeling like I don't want to be associated to those people. By me opening up online, I will then be seen as one of those because it's different, right? So there's like this. If you look at, there's some amazing resources on like how to unpack and share your story. And like one of the most famous one is the 12-step process of Joseph Campbell, who wrote the Hero of the Thousand Faces, and who basically found that there was a monomyth across all different cultures, religion throughout history, and that you could recognize all the protagonists basically went through the same system, and whether that's Alice in Wonderland or The Matrix or Game of Thrones or whatever. So they're all great, but they're often not very practical or easy to implement, especially in a business context or professional setting, right? So one of the things that I teach in the book is to go, okay, so if you break, so the first, by the way, if you want like a really practical tip for people listening, the first exercise I get people to do is to just map out your stories, both professional and personal, throughout your whole life. You take a big piece of paper, A3, A4, whatever you get, put a bit of music on, hopefully with no lyrics on, that's my advice. And then you just map out, like from birth to date, what are some of the big moments that shaped you in some way or form, good and bad, right? So maybe your parents separated, maybe you had to move countries, maybe you went through some really traumatic experience, maybe you won a trophy, maybe you got to promote, whatever it is, you just write all those stories out, right? That's effectively, I would call that your story bank. You kind of, that also call it your river of life. So you map out all those stories. That can be overwhelming, right? You go, oh, what do I do all this, Mark? That's great. I run a soccer competition or a football tournament when I was like 6. How's that relevant? Now, this is where people go wrong. Most people are too close to their own stories. So there's like these, I think 9 or 10 blockers I talk about in my story about what gets in the way of sharing a story. One of them is, I don't see how my story is important or how my story matters. So the metaphor I use is, so Rupi, I ask, what's your favorite movie? Like if you had to go back right now and rewatch a film that you love, what's one of your favorite films?
That's a really good question. I get asked this a lot. I'm going to panic now. I mean,
don't overthink it. There's one that came up to mind that you probably judge as like, I can't say that out loud, but is there a film that came up that you're just thinking, even if it's not the right one?
It's recently been Halloween, and one of my favorite horror movies of all time is Saw. I freaking love Saw. It's amazing.
The first one. Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, got you. So how many times would you say, okay, so first of all, the first time you saw Saw, What was it about Saw that was so special for you? Like, what were the
Scared
feelings
me.
that you felt? What is it
I
that
was I
scared
was at
you?
med school. I was living in the basement of this house, and I'm a rational human being, right? And I was scared to go down into the basement after watching this movie.
Yeah. So it made you
So I had an
feel, right? What
emotional,
I'm
I had a
getting is
real
that,
strong emotional
yeah,
connection, like,
yeah.
a
And
reaction
a
to this
lingering
movie.
one, a lingering one. It
Yeah.
wasn't just like in the moment. It's like, it had an inception moment, right? Like
Yeah.
you were going around, creeping around like, oh, cool. So how many times would you say you've seen Saw since?
3 times, I think.
3 times. Cool. So imagine if I had to sit you down and I told you, right, Rupi, for the next 10 days, I want you to sit down. You're going to watch this film 10 times back to back. How do you think you'd feel after the 10th time?
Probably very bored, emotionless. I probably wouldn't feel scared anymore.
Sure. Now imagine if I had to sit you down and you had to watch 100, maybe even 1,000 times back to back. How do you think you feel about your story then?
Pretty numb.
Yeah. So that is how we are all with our own stories. We are with our stories on a day-to-day basis, and it's so just boring to us that we don't see the value of it. But what you need to understand is that when you share your story for the first time, it will be that Saw for the first time, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So one of the first things I tell people is like, take a meta view, take a helicopter view of your story and realize that you've been in the editing suite for way too long. You've been looking at this story over and over again for whatever since it happened. So for you, it's boring, it's irrelevant, it's not interesting. But what you will find is that when you start sharing your story with someone else, someone might be like, wow, that's amazing. And you'll be like, really?
Yeah.
And look, I've had people come on my show from they've rode, across the Atlantic on their own with no training whatsoever, right? Beat some world record. And they're just like, yeah, but anyone could do that. But we all victims of this. We all are. And look, you don't have to have this life-changing dramatic event for your story to be relevant. But the point is, the reason why I'm saying this is that I want people to understand that you might not be the best judge of your own story. Because like the example, if you think about your favorite film, if you saw it 100 times, so imagine if you were the producer and you watched the Saw 100 times, like this is boring, and it didn't release it with the world. Imagine all the rupees of the world out there who would have missed out on that experience. And that's what I'm telling people. Like, you don't know yet just how far and wide your story can impact. But if you focus on just changing one person's life who needs to hear it to not feel alone, that's your job's done. And I know that can feel like, yeah, great, Mark, but that's one person who might go on and share it to one person, and you have a ripple effect, right? So to come back to the practical tool, you've got the river of life. By the way, did that make sense, that example?
That
of the
made
story
total
in the film?
sense. That's such a cool exercise to do. And actually that realization that because you sit with your story so much, it blunts the effect. It's almost like, the hedonic adaptation. Once you get used to having this beautiful iPhone that is as powerful as your computer, 10 times over when you were a kid, you kind of just get used to it. It's like, oh yeah, it's just my iPhone.
Yeah.
It's
by the way, the technology of this put someone on the moon. Yeah,
exactly.
The same technology, right? That is in here, put someone on the moon, peeps. Like, no, but that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so if you come back to this idea, and I'm just really going quickly through some of the process I had to share in the book, but so you've mapped out all your stories and you go, great, Mark, now what? So then I go, look, imagine if I told you that you may not yet see what are some of the most powerful gems that you have in your stories. So anything's game, right? In your metaphor, if you want to go and do some amazing cooking and you want to teach your audience like how to make the most of what you got, you've probably got to go through your pantry. You've probably got to go through like, what ingredients do you have? You can only do that when you map them all out, right? Like you've probably got some really neatly structured in your kitchen around like the spices and stuff, but you need to see all the spices so that you know which ones you can use. You need to see how much, grains or legumes or beans you've got in your storage. It's the same thing. Like the metaphor I use again around this is my nephew, Liam, and my niece, Emma, right? When they were little, they used to play with this pile of Legos that my brother and I used to play 40 years ago. And it's this really old denim bag that one of my mum's mates built with like some red string so that when you pull it up, it kind of looks like a Santa bag. And then they would put it on the floor and we would just play for like hours and build all these different Lego structures and pieces with like, honestly, I don't even know if it's Lego stuff, but there were pieces of Lego and all this stuff. But the point was, in order for us to see what we could build, we had to put everything on the floor. So Marie Kondo, right? Like her principles of tidying up is you need to have all your socks and boxer shorts in front of you and all your Bic pens in one place so you could really go through them. It's the same thing with your story. Like if you hold back, and when you do this process, a really important part is no one's going to see this apart from you. No one. So you can put everything and anything you want on this, knowing that you will. I'm not asking you to share any of this because, by the way, spoiler alert. Yeah, I'm a big believer that if you share your story, it can change your life and transform your business and impact the world. This stuff, but you don't have to because it will actually change the way you feel already, and how you show up will change and have an impact, right? But once you got all the pieces on the floor, I will say just pick one for the sense of this exercise right now that we're doing. Your audience, just pick a story, right? So maybe for you, it was this idea of Saw, right? We can go with the idea of the story of Saw. Like, how is Saw going to be relevant to the doctor's kitchen today, right? Well, we're going to work with that in a second. We're going to come up with something. So the way that you make it helpful is that you take that story. So you go, I don't know, do you remember what year it was? Do you remember what year this was that you saw? I can't remember.
2004.
Okay, 2004. So it's 2004. I'm sitting in my basement. My ears are plugged into my laptop and I'm watching this film, Saw, that my friend's been bugging me to watch. And he said, you've got to watch it on your own. And I'm like, that sounds weird, but I'm watching it. And then they might talk about then the credits rolling in and I'm shocked and I'm stunned, But here's what's really scary. I'm starting to freak out. I'm a rational person. I'm a doctor. I'm a junior doctor. I know that it's not rational, but I'm sure that there's a guy with a mask behind my kitchen cupboard and I'm not going down that basement, right? So you've kind of took us into the story. You've made us a little bit feel, and this is where most people go wrong, especially when we talked about I'm crying online and, trying to seek some attention through vulnerability, which can be helpful and sometimes not. The really important part is the message. Why is that relevant? What did you learn? What can you teach? What can you give as a result? So I'm going to make something up on the spot, right? But if it was for you, it's I realized that this boogeyman, this thing that we're scared of, we all have that even today. And that doesn't have to look like with a mask. It can look like I'm an incompetent chef. I'm so scared of opening that cupboard because what if I realize that I don't know how to cook for my family? And so then you could land that message that way. It made no sense what I just said, but the idea is you land a message. And if you can break down your stories by basically going, it's called context. So take me, what's going on, content, share with me what's happened, and then conclusion. What is it that you learn from it? Or you can say it's take me, tell me, teach me. If you can break your stories that way, I've seen it with clients. I've seen it in workshops. I've seen it countless times. It's amazing because then you get a really simple structure. You kind of just go, and I actually share in the book, like a bunch of podcast guests and friends, I show you the formula in action. And you'd be amazed now that I've told you this 3-step formula, how much you'll recognize it in people who show up, right? And especially thought leaders space, right? Who authors and influencers, whatever you call us. They use a very similar method. And it's just a very simple one that everybody listening can practice with. And what I will finish off with this is that particular point is pick a story that right now feels okay, not too scary, but maybe not too safe either. Break it down, use that methodology, and then try and share it with someone you trust, someone you might feel like the likelihood of it backlashing is pretty minimal, and start seeing what happens. And what I want more than anything, and this is what I've seen with clients, what I've seen with beta readers of the book who told me all this, is that they were amazed and shocked at what came back. What they thought was going to be backlash and rejection and hatred and trolling and fill in the blank, what they got is connection and love and acceptance. And that's, I can't think of a bigger wish I have for audience members and this people listening or watching to this, is this idea that, oh, maybe I am enough. Maybe it's okay that I'm not perfect. And maybe there is connection through the story. And, I said to you that the original title was going to be If Only You Knew Me. Then the second title I wanted was From Shame to Service. But it hasn't got a mainstream appeal. So I went for something a little bit different. But that's what it is, right? Think about it. Think about everybody listening to this. If they could go from shame to service in some shape, way, or form, which is focusing on myself, I'm bad, or I've done bad things, or I'm not good enough, and all the focus and attention's on myself, to suddenly going, how can I help? How can I serve? What can I do? And that's like a bit of a pet dream of mine.
Yeah, that's epic, man. That framework. I wish I did that last week. That I went to Norfolk on my own. I rented a cabin in the woods, no mobile, no Wi-Fi, none of that stuff. Like no reading material, no music, no podcast, nothing. It was literally just me. I had my dog with me, and I had some pens and some big A1 sheets and stuff, and I was just like mapping out like manifestations and affirmations, and where I want to put my myself, my business, my personal life, all that kind of stuff. I mean, I think it's a good exercise to do, particularly after just getting married, and you have all this like incredible dopamine high of like seeing everyone, and then all of a sudden you're on your own. I think it's a really, really cool activity and something I want to do at least once a year. But I wish I did this exercise now, dude. The 3-step framework of figuring out my timeline.
It's not too late. It's not too late. And you're coming to the book launch on the 8th of December, right? And look, it's a lifelong journey. I think what I will say to that is it's never too late. And things always come up. Like I've got a stack of stories, right? I've got like these cards of stories that I haven't unpacked, and I don't even know if they're relevant or not, but that's beside the point. And I don't know if you noticed, if you go back and listen to the start of this interview, when you asked me to introduce myself, I just used that 3-step framework, right? I'm an 8-year-old kid, I'm a 6-year-old kid, I'm in a classroom, I'm being bullied. It was really tough, but this is what I learned, right? People think that I'm a natural storyteller, and up to a certain point, I'm very comfortable on stage because I hated being in the classroom. So my escape was stage. My mum was a school teacher for 35 years, and she put up school plays. And I used to be like a bush or like a lamppost on stage from like the age of 4, And I was always been comfortable on stage because I wasn't judged on my ability to read. I wasn't judged on my ability to read out loud or spell or do maths. But for some reason, I was at home on stage. And so I do have a natural ability to feel very comfortable on stage. But what I've learned is that anyone can learn this, and wherever you are is fine. It's perfect, and you're going to get better at sharing a story. And by the way, one of my clients said this sentence that I totally coined now and stolen. It will sharpen as you share. Your version now of how you talk about how you started Doctor's Kitchen, no doubt, is very different than 2012 or 2015.
Yeah. That's it's completely it's refined. It's it's still the same story, obviously, but it's just the delivery, the punctuations, the succinctness, or the length of it if it needs to be, the depth, the sort of emotional elements to it. I've got better actually at diving into more of the sort of vulnerabilities of that story and future stories as well. It's
what was scary about it? I don't want to put you on the spot.
No,
but what did you find most scary about diving a little bit more into that side of the story?
Because I think one of the things that you are sort of inadvertently taught through both experience and also sort of the methodologies within medical school is to be that sort of authority figure. And I think we've got better at becoming more partners in health with patients rather than the dictators. But there is still that sort of authoritarian vibe to what we...
Trust me, I'm a doctor.
Exactly. Yeah. There's the undertone. And when you become a patient, all of a sudden that carpet is ripped off from beneath your feet. And, it's a vulnerable position to be in. And it's something that I don't wish upon anyone, but it certainly was helpful for me. And something I look back on with immense gratitude, because if I hadn't had that experience, I wouldn't really know what it's like. And I think that time in my life was very scary because there was a lot of indecision. I was going, I wouldn't say I was going against medical advice, but I certainly wasn't going, according to what most
conventional.
Medics would have.
Conventional route.
Exactly. Yeah, it was unconventional, to coin your podcast title. But it's it was a scary time in my life, but also like talking about that openly in the context of a medical community, which is very sort of guideline driven. It's for very good reasons. We are evidence based. That there isn't as
no
much
opinion.
there isn't as much sort of flex in that community for sort of going outside the norm. I think we're getting better at that, but yeah, that was certainly certain elements of that were emotional and scary for sure.
I bet.
Yeah.
And look, and I just want to acknowledge you for sharing your story and for going down that path, because for people like me who are outside the medical world, who don't really understand that industry, like my partner, she went down that road of psychology at uni, then neuroscience at Oxford, and was going to do a PhD in neuroscience, and decided that she wanted to quit the labs to go and do something else in the end. But what she told me is that you're taught to not have an opinion that isn't based on facts and peer reviewed data and all this stuff. And so people come out of the medical world are riddled with imposter syndrome. What I've found is that people find it really difficult to stand out. Like, there's a few of you who managed to come out and really, stand out, and you're making ripple waves. And I think it's amazing. I wish there were more, but I don't want to underestimate, the effort that it must have taken for you to come out and say, yeah, I think there's another way. And I think having 4 hours of teaching about a diet and the impact on health in like a 7-year degree doesn't scream like this is right. Yeah. So, on behalf of everyone who kind of follows you and is inspired by what you do, it's no small feat, and it takes tremendous courage. And I'm grateful that you did that.
Thanks, man. No, I appreciate it. And I think, it's funny when you sit with that story, as you've eloquently described on this pod, you're sort of blunted to it as well. And sometimes I feel like, there's space to go even deeper. I mean, I have a lot of beliefs around Ayurveda and traditional medicine. I think psychology, the impact of trauma is hugely responsible for a number of the ailments that we see within primary care, secondary care. But there isn't as much sort of solid evidence around that. And so it makes it quite difficult for a person in my position who wants to maintain credibility to actually talk about these different elements. But I do it in sort of like a nuanced way. Like we've had Dr. David Hamilton on the pod talking about alternative medicine, complementary therapy. He comes across... He looks at everything through a scientific lens because he used to work in pharma himself. He's a trained scientist. So I love having those kind of discussions and like veering on the edge of what might be acceptable within the medical community. Yeah, exactly. It's just just putting myself out of that comfort zone, I think, is a good sort of strategy.
Well, I think also having your curiosity hat on.
Yeah,
I think there's an element of humility which you bring to the table, which is we may not have all the answers yet, and everything might not make sense right now. We might not have the data to back up, but it makes sense, or I could see how, someone might tell you, like, Ruby, there's no empirical evidence that trauma causes some form of physical illness in the body, or could spark a eating disorder or whatever, right? And you might be cool. There might not be empirical evidence, but it seems strange that, a lot of the patients I work with for obesity, I'm not saying this is the case, by the way, but, imagine you'd be like, a common thread that I found a lot of my patients who have obesity is they've had some form of neglect or abuse as kids. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I can't put my finger on it. I'm just, and I think it's almost like that's how everything starts, like a kind of assumption or a theory. And what I'm hearing you say is that you're chasing your curiosities without being too rigid about them being the empirical truth for everyone. But you're going, it's pulling me. Like you've got this field of curiosity that's putting you to going, there might be something else here that we're not quite seeing. And I think that's exciting. I think it's scary and courageous to go so, but I think if you put it under the hat of curiosity, it makes it less kind of, I am now shifting my entire belief system around this new alternative medicine, and everything else is big pharma's terrible. It's nuanced. I think we've lost the ability of being nuanced as a society. I think we're so divided, and that's a whole other pod conversation, but I think it's needed at pushing boundaries, because if we don't do that, that we don't break through old molds or old belief systems that might be preventing us from, becoming better humans.
Yeah, absolutely. Talking of pushing boundaries, man, I'm super excited about this book, the impact it's already had on me in this brief conversation, but also, the hopefully tens, hundreds of thousands, or maybe even millions of people who will read it as well. So looking forward to the launch and doing a little spiel whilst I'm there, being vulnerable on stage.
Yes. I basically, for people listening to this, I've emotionally blackmailed Rupi into saying a few words on the night with a few other my friends and guests on the podcast. But yeah, no, that'll be the 8th of December. The book, I don't know when the podcast is coming out, but yeah, the book's available to pre-order on any platform that you look for. Just type in Glow in the Dark, Mark Leruste, coming up with Hachette. And yeah, it's a labor of love. I'll say that, and it sounds really pretentious to say this, but I really believe in this book, and I really love this book. And I know it sounds so weird because I'm usually the kind of person that says, Rupi, no, I mean, it's okay. It's fine. No, I feel like this book could do some really good in the world at the moment, which is around just accepting ourselves a little bit more. I'll tell you this, and maybe I'll finish with this really quick point. When politicians mess up in a very public way and then get fired or have to resign, and all these memes come up and we can all point fingers and all this stuff. And I get it. Like, there's a part of me that also laughs and the part of me that also engages, but there's another part of me that goes, dehumanizing each other doesn't help on the long run. And I feel what we could do a little bit more of, again, is seeing that we also have some stories that might be difficult to own. And by avoiding rejecting them, we can accept others. And if you want to hear like a deep message to fall off on, is if you want to start accepting your own story, start accepting others a little bit more, and see if you've got judgment on when people open up about things that might be difficult for them to share. And that might be one of the first ports of call for yourself, is to kind of go, what is this a mirror for me to accept myself more? What can I lean into this question to accept? Because ultimately, this is the tip that helped me through this whole book writing. Because you've written, how many cookbooks have you written now?
4.
Oh my God. I don't know how you put yourself through that. I mean, honestly, people listening to this, if you haven't written a book, you'd have no idea like how emotionally stressful and draining it is. But the one question that really helped me, and I've given this to friends and clients, it's how can I love myself more as I go through this process? Which I cringe even saying that out loud. People who can't see my face, I'm like just sucked on a lemon right now. But it's true. Like, if you can learn how to love yourself more through this process of you owning and unpacking and sharing your story, then everything else will be gravy.
Appreciate that, man. And listen, I'm so glad you spent the time to jump on the pod, share some wisdom. We're homies. I look forward to seeing you very soon and supporting you on your next steps, man. You've been a massive source of support for me, so I'm so thankful to have you and your wisdom in my life, man. So appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you.
If you enjoyed that video, you will love the library of content that we have on doctorskitchen.com. Make sure you hit subscribe, and we have podcasts in our library on brain health, well-being, supplements, and lots more. Have a wonderful day.